Chapter 19. Immigrants. The country was becoming more and more urbanized. Now, by urbanized, that meant urbanization. That means that there's a big move toward the cities. Structural steel. And yeah, both my grandfather and his father, my great-grandfather, worked with structural steel. Structural steel made possible the invention of the skyscraper and of course, bridges. Bridges now could be bigger, and it led to people building bridges across the very wide Hudson River, and bridges that connected New York's Long Island to the mainland, and New York's Staten Island to the mainland and to Long Island. And eventually a bridge was built across San Francisco Bay. But all this came about as a result of structural steel, and structural steel meant that skyscrapers could be made taller. And skyscrapers now can be made that are more than 1,000 feet tall, more than 100 stories off the ground. But urbanization, it was not always good. The big cities became a place for high crime rates, and a lot of places for people who are poor. Now, a lot of this chapter talks about the fights between the rich and the poor. That led to some people saying that all of history is a class struggle. This is what Karl Marx believed, that all of history is a class struggle. But anyway, the rich and poor got involved in fights. The poor began to get together and form unions. Now, I want to say this, folk. Labor unions are almost a thing of the past. Most of you may never ever join a union. And when I was at Lockheed, I was both salaried and hourly. I kicked around from one job to another. Some of it by my choice and some of it not by my choice. But unions, blue-collar workers formed together and joined unions. And unions, to get their way, will resort to a strike. The word strike means we will not work until you agree with us, or until we come to some kind of an agreement. The opposite of a strike is a lockout, but that's where management locks the workers out until he wins his point. But we won't talk about lockouts, even though one of my brothers was involved with the lockout at Armco Steel, and during the lockout he just retired, where the Armco Steel locked out its workers until they agreed. The big issue there was health care benefits. The cost of health care rose and rose and rose and rose, and companies got to where they said they couldn't afford to pay it, including my company, Lockheed. When I first started at Lockheed, our health care was free. By the time I left, we were paying $45 a week for our health care. That did not cover it all. That was our share. The company paid the rest. The cost of health care went from about $3 or $4 a month at one time to $700, $800, $900, $1,000 a month. You younger people who aren't paying will soon, if you haven't found out already, you'll soon find out what I'm talking about. The cost of health care is so expensive that my oldest daughter, see, when you turn 26, your parents' health care no longer covers you, and you have to find it on your own. My second daughter just turned 26 last month. She has no coverage. My oldest daughter turned 26 a few years ago. Officially, she's covered. Her deductible, $15,000. That means she has to pay the first 15 grand. Then after that, her health care kicks in. She might as well not be covered, yes?
I've been here for some years, but don't we pay taxes when it goes to the medical?
That's Medicare.
We do, yes. But again,
Different thing?
there are persons who are pushing for universal health care for everyone. The problem with that is Europe is doing it, and Canada is doing it. And oftentimes people have died waiting to see a doctor. Like you have symptoms of like colorectal cancer. You phone your doctor, he can see it in November. That's the earliest he can see it. This actually is going on. Yeah.
I mean, I'm from Mexico, and we also have health
Yeah, okay.
And doesn't happen that way. And they're
It
not
doesn't work that
charged,
way?
I mean, at the high levels of it, how expensive Medicare would be.
Our health care was not as expensive. Okay, now folk, this may step on some toes. Our health care, not until Barack Obama became president and passed Obamacare in 2010. That really did a lot to send health care costs through the roof. Now, if any of you object to that, your comments are welcome. But our health care was not that bad until then. It's called Obamacare. It was also called the Affordable Care Act.
So you really think yet that the healthcare that America had before that was not that bad? That's really what you think?
I really do. It was the best in the world. But you had to pay out of your own pocket, okay.
So that means that people that cannot afford care cannot go.
Let me give you an illustration, folks. A few years ago, we had two big ships that were hit. They did not go under because we closed off sections of the ships. Men were trapped in those sections that were closed off, and they died. What is the point I'm making? There are people, and I want to say it clearly, who are left out. But socialism, I mean, okay, capitalism leaves a few people out. There are people who can't afford it. But under socialism, everybody winds up being left out. In other words, if they had not closed the doors to those ships when they were struck by other ships, the whole ships would have gone down and the whole crew would have perished. By closing off certain doors where the water was leaking in, they saved most of the crew and most of the ships, but the ships remained afloat. Now, this is hard. I want to tell you something else. I want to tell you something else. During World War II, we were in on the German and Japanese code. We knew what they were planning. We learned one day that a certain British city was going to be bombed. If we had warned that city they were going to be bombed, and folks, this is going to sound awful, it would have let the Germans know we're in on our code, they'd have changed the codes, we could have lost the war. We let that city be bombed and people died. Years later, this was found out. You let my daddy die because you could have warned him and didn't. This is the way life is, folk. The alternative is to warn the people that, hey, get out of the city, the Germans are going to bomb it. The Germans know that we're in our code, they change the code, we lose the code. This is reality. Okay, now.
No, my question is like not affordable. Even back then, they were doing disputes over the health care and the benefit. But I'm saying it from a perspective of another country, a country that is less powerful and more poor, like Mexico, has the ability to provide health care to a lot of people. And there's a lot of, I mean, I'm just saying.
What you're
over here it's
dealing
a
with
little
is
bit
something
more.
that's really, really complex, extremely complex. I mean, Coretta Scott King went to Baja, California, actually out of Mexico, to get medical care late in her life. Again, because it was universal. Do they have the same, what I'm getting at, there's some talk, do they have the same standard of care that we have?
They do. My friend couldn't get fixed, well, something problem with her stomach, and she had to go there, and it was half the price, and she got saved.
I mean,
That's
okay.
why I was confused with, you know.
Yeah, well, again,
this
folks,
health-
this is going to be hard for somebody to understand because you've been told all your life that the government must provide health care, the government must provide free education, the government must help you when you get in poverty, the government must get out of depression, and you're hearing something different now. And some of you just are really upset, I mean, at least one of us really upset at hearing this. That no, it's up to you and as individuals to pull ourselves out. Now, this is hardcore, I mean, I know. And
I mean,
some-
I'm saying,
Go
we're
ahead.
talking about the problem since.
I really
yeah.
honestly do not know enough about what you're asking to really answer me, because I don't know that much about Mexico. I mean, I've been there one, I don't know that much. I don't know what quality of health care they have. I don't know how much they pay their doctors. I don't know. In other words, why is Mexican health care so much cheaper than it is here? And again, the answer is I simply don't know. Well, American doctors have to pay about $100,000 a year or more for lawsuit insurance. And I don't think Mexican doctors do. In other words, you're talking apple and orange. And I really don't know the answer to your questions. I don't know.
No, because I'm going back to, since then, there have been issues in the unions about their health care program.
Well, okay. What I do know, here's what I know about America. Now, this is America. The cost of health care, beginning around 1980 or so, I hired in 1979, but beginning around 1980. And in 1974, I took out health insurance for $9 for 6 months. Really cheap. But today, the cost is, my wife's paying about $900 for me and her and my youngest son. $900 every year. Really, really expensive compared to what it once was. And what made the cost rise up?
That's,
Well, I've already answered that as best I could and offended one of your classmates pretty badly by saying so. But the cost of health care went out of sight. And some of it, folks, one reason, and I'll tell you one reason health care costs went up is health care today is much, much better than it was. I mean, we have people walking around today who would mean, all right, I've asked this class question to younger students than you. How many of you believe if you had been born 100 years before you were born, you'd be dead by now due to some disease you had that today's doctors have cured? A few hands are going up. Yeah, a few. I would have been. I've had double pneumonia 2 or 3 times. Today's doctors, health care is better. That's one reason. Another reason is lawsuits. Today's doctors have to protect themselves from lawsuits, and that's expensive. But these gadgets that you see in hospitals are not cheap. They're effective, but they are not cheap. So again, I don't know what the quality of health care in Mexico is. I don't know, so I can't really answer your question. I do know a lot of Canadians used to come to the United States because they couldn't get to see their own doctor. And the ones who could afford it now, what about the ones who couldn't afford it? They were left out. But a lot of Canadians, and a lot of Europeans would come to the United States, and a lot of people from Islamic countries would come to the United States to seek medical care because our health care was better than anyone else's. But my daughter actually has a $15,000 deductible. For real. And this story is told 1,000 times over throughout the country. Now again, okay, we can discuss this further. Okay, we'll move on. All right. The strikes, again, strikes have involved benefits, pay. Grover Cleveland had to deal with a great railroad strike. Here is a story of one of these great railroad strikes. So there was a Pullman strike in 1871. Essentially, what the railroads were doing, this has been outlawed since, but they were hiring a worker, and once you were hired, you lived in the town where all the other workers, basically, the railroad companies would build a town where all their workers were expected to live. And every worker was expected to shop at the company store and only buy from the company store. Now there's a song, popular song was popular when I was a kid, 16 tons and what do you get? And then the one line of that song was, St. Peter, don't you call me because I can't go. I owe my soul to the company store. In other words, you had to buy everything from the company store. You lived in the company housing project. And you worked for the company. But you basically, the company would get its money back from you, or the company would pay you. Then you'd use your money that the company paid you to pay rent on the house, the company house, and go to the company store and buy your food and clothing and whatever else you need, your medicines at the company store. Well, the bad thing about this was what would happen if the company laid off, and folks, layoff is a big part of life. Lockheed would lay off their workers sometime. One time Lockheed laid off 25,000 workers in a year's time. This was in 1971. They went from 33,000 employees to 7,000. When I was there, they went from 20,000 to 8,000. They let off 12,000 employees in 1988. I was not one of them. 1988 and 1989. Big layoffs. You lay off workers when you don't have work for them anymore. And this is still a reason. Well, the company laid off its workers, but still they did not reduce the rents and did not reduce the amount they were charging at their store, and the workers became upset. And President Hayes said, I understand these workers that are striking, they're honest people, but he felt like he had to move, and at one point he moved the Federal Army in on private citizens to break up strikes. This this actually happened, and he said, I know these people, that they're just honest, hard-working people like the rest of us, but he felt like that they had no right to strike, or no right to disrupt. See, a railroad strike meant that commerce could not be moved. It meant that coal could not be moved from the mines to people's private homes, and it was really, really very upsetting. Well, now, immigration. This is still a big issue. A lot of immigrants were coming in from Europe. Italians were coming in droves. And yes, I met some of them because when I was a kid, we lived in Pennsylvania, and a lot of my classmates were Italian. But the Italians would move to the north, much more so than the south. Immigrant labor did a lot to build New York City. Immigrants would do the jobs that other people, Americans, would not do, and this was true 100 years ago, the same way it's true now. But there came a cry for restriction of immigration because certain immigrants were not wanted. Particularly, I mentioned this earlier, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed.
This is in chapter 19?
Yeah.
This is in the previous chapter, but I'm going to mention it again
Okay.
because it was part of the restrictions on immigration. Now, again, you caught on. I had mentioned the Chinese Exclusion Act a couple chapters ago, but the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed to stop Chinese immigrants. In addition, eventually Japanese were stopped from coming into the country. The Japanese Exclusion Act. And of course, there was a problem with Mexicans. The Mexican issue, folk, this is far from new. It's been going on for more than 100 years. Mexicans would come into our country during times of prosperity, hoping to find a better life here. And a lot of times they have not always been wanted. Now, these immigrants would get together in places called ghettos. In other words, the Italians would live in little Italies, the places in New York and Chicago where that mostly Italians live. Or the Germans would live in places where only the Germans lived. And sometimes someone was slow at learning English because you go to these places and you find them speaking Italian, even here in the United States. Now, eventually, of course, they learned English, but they were slow at mixing in and slow at you might say, slow at amalgamating. Now, the first big union, I'll just put it the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, otherwise abbreviated AFL. The American Federation of Labor got together, a big union, and they hoped they would represent all workers. In other words, but eventually the auto workers formed their own union called the UAW, United Auto Workers, and Lockheed was part of the aerospace union. IAMA, National Association of Machinists, IAMAW, National Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers, IAMAW. But the AFL tried to get all unskilled laborers together from different factories. In other words, steel workers, railroad workers, etc., etc. And tried to get these people in their unions. But companies, to get around unions, would sometimes hire what's called white-collar workers or management type. People who worked in office jobs. Persons who shuffled pencils, sometimes called pencil pushers. People who shuffled papers, filed papers away, and you might think office work would be pleasant, but in those days office work was really rough because offices were not air conditioned. And in the hot summertime, a person sitting in an office would really have a tough time keeping himself cool. He'd have to fan himself, or every once in a while get up and go to a file cabinet and pretend to be looking for something, then go back to his desk and pretend to try to be working because, again, conditions were miserable. But this was before the invention of the air conditioner, before the widespread use of the air conditioner. Now, Anyway, in the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, that's when President Hayes called out the army to break up the strike because it was looked on as an insurrection. Several people on both sides died. There was another big strike at Haymarket, which I definitely want you to remember. Folk, having been a former union worker myself, these people suffered a lot and did a lot, and they benefited little from it. Now, I was reminded, Lockheed went on strike while I was a member of Lockheed's union, and we were told, well, you'll never gain back what you lost during the strike. Folk, this was very, very true. But then again, you're not striking for yourself, though a lot of you're striking for other people who come after you. These Haymarket strikers, as well as the strikers during the Great Railroad Strike, did not gain a lot, but they gained a little. And maybe the next strike would gain a little bit more. And over a period of several generations, the workers would keep on gaining. World War I and World War II did a lot to promote, particularly World War II, when a lot of workers had to leave the factories for long periods of time. And factories needed workers so badly they were hiring crippled people and hiring women in droves. And they were stealing each other's work or paying them more. It took a long time, but eventually the fruits of these people's efforts did bear fruit. It did bring forth baseball. Baseball is not as popular today as it once was, but baseball, the first baseball game in America was played in Cooperstown. I believe the year was 1829. Some people who've studied believes it goes back to a game called town ball that is known to have been played in Europe in the 1300s, where these men would use a stick to try to hit a sock that was stuffed with rags, and they hit a sock. This may have been the forerunner of baseball, but the original baseball game was played in Cooperstown, New York. In 1869, you had your first professional team, the Cincinnati Red Stockings. Now, don't be confused like I was many years. Today's Cincinnati Reds are not the original Cincinnati Red Stockings. The Cincinnati Red Stockings moved to Boston and became the Boston Red Sox. So their first professional team is actually the Boston Red Sox. As for Cincinnati, they formed a new team called the Cincinnati Redlegs, or today they're called the Cincinnati Reds. But anyway, in 1869, Cincinnati paid its players, and they won all 59 of the games they played until they got to Brooklyn, and they played an unpaid team from Brooklyn. And in a hard-fought game, the Brooklyn team pulled out ahead of Cincinnati and beat them. And some people thought this would be the end of professional baseball. As we all know, they were wrong. More and more cities started paying its players, and eventually by 1881, I believe the National League of Professional Baseball Teams was formed. Today called the National League. In 1901, the American League was formed. Some people have said recently that baseball was an ideal sport for people who, during the hot summers, just simply could not get out and work the fields, had to take a few hours off. So take a few hours off, go watch a baseball game. And that way they could keep fanning themselves and keep cool while the game was going on. And then, once the game was over with, they get back to their farm work. But anyway, baseball is still around, not as popular as it was. Coney Island. Amusement parks come on the scene, and also structural steel helped amusement parks. Now, your roller coaster rides used to be made out of wood, but then they started using structural steel, and thanks to structural steel, roller coaster rides are more thrilling than they once were. Yeah, I go to Six Flags pretty regularly, but I no longer ride the thrilling rides. When you get to be my age, they have a permanent effect on your body. Your body is never the same again. Now, when you're most of the age you people look like you are, you can ride them. Me, I don't ride them anymore. You have limits, folks. But I used to ride the Cannonball, some of those rides, but not anymore. Mindbender, no, not for me. But structural steel. Now, Coney Island was the most famous park, and it was said that probably 1 million people visit that park every year. Your book gives a figure. It's a pretty high figure. But these amusements, your book calls them cheap amusements, when you could go to a baseball game for 10 cents a ticket. And when I say players were paid, they were not paid as much as in those days as factory workers made. It was not a big thing, but eventually ball players began to demand more, and owners had to shell out more bucks to keep their star ball players around. And baseball led to professional basketball, professional soccer players, professional football. Football did not become as popular until much later. More so than New York, Chicago led the way to building skyscrapers. Here is the story of Chicago. Around, I believe it was 1871 or thereabouts, a great fire occurred in Chicago. Now, the story of how the fire started, folk, nobody really knows. There's one story going around that there was a gas lantern sitting on top of a haystack, and a cow kicked over the lantern, and in no time flat, thanks to the kerosene in the lantern and the hay, the fire got out of control and spread all over the city. Whatever happened, a large part of the city of Chicago burned to the ground. They did not have the means to fight fires that we have today, but the Great Chicago Fire is a big disaster, except for one thing. The people of Chicago, just like the people of Atlanta, rebuilt another city. In place of the wooden buildings, frame buildings in Chicago, Chicago built steel skyscrapers that were 10 and 20 stories high. Later they were to build bigger buildings. The tallest building in America right now is in Chicago. Now, if any of you know different, the Sears Tower is probably. Now, if any of you know different, your input is welcome. But ever since the towers in New York were knocked down, a twin tower knocked down, the Chicago towers became the biggest. The biggest, tallest building in the world is not even in the United States. As I understand, right, it's in Yemen, or somewhere in the Arabian Peninsula. Now, we come to the party bosses, the most famous of whom was Tweed.
Boss Tweed.
Here's a story of Tweed in New York. He was founder of Tammany Hall. These men would take advantage of the poor immigrants. The immigrants would come over here with practically nothing. And a man from Tweed's office would get a hold of them and say, hey, we can help you get set up and help you get a job. And these immigrants then were guaranteed to keep voting men like Tweed and his cronies, not call them cronies, they were outlawed, into office. Time and again, and nobody, it seemed, could defeat them. And they would get voted into office. And then once in the office, they would take tax money, government money, and use it for their own personal use. The most famous, the most notorious was a man named Tweed. Eventually, Tweed fled the country to escape prosecution, but he was hunted down and he wound up spending the last year of his life in prison. He went on for a long time, but as the case of so many of those bad men, they eventually get caught.
Where did that?
This was in New York. He was the founder of Tammany Hall. Tammany Hall was a place where these corrupt bosses, political bosses, got together and did their dirty deeds, like steal the people's tax money or bribe people into voting for them. In those days, now before the secret ballot, politicians could buy votes. Politicians would have their men go to the poll and meet up with someone who looked poor and say, hey, we'll give you $1, which was a lot of money back then, if you'll vote for such and such. And the voting was done right in the wide open, so they knew if the man was actually voting. And once he was through voting, they'd give him a $1 bill, sometimes $2. It became a big thing in the South, too. The politicians would sell the votes at $3, $4, $5 a vote. And buying votes became a big thing. Today, supposedly, all the balloting is done in secret to where nobody knows how you're voting, and that way it discourages people from buying votes. I'm not saying that